have reached a point of malnutrition on the streets to which they had then collapsed. And I was asked to tend to one young man, and his eyes were very bright, and I asked the priest, it appears like he's really focused, and he said, no. He said, no, this young man has been starving to death. His body has started to damage its own organs. There's no recovery. All we can do is minister to his comfort. And that involved taking sections of grapefruit and wiping them across his lips. I also visited a refugee center in Juba in South Sudan, where the children's level of malnutrition was measured by an armband. It's one way of getting a quick sense of how little food they've had. It's called a mid-upper arm circumference. It's color-coded, green to yellow to red, so aid workers can quickly see the severity of the malnutrition, the extent, if you will, of the impact of starvation. And I visited refugee camps in Somalia and in Kenya and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where families were fleeing conflict and quite frankly, fleeing starvation. Starvation is sometimes the result of the chaos of war, sometimes the result of natural disasters, sometimes agricultural disasters. But what we're seeing now in the Middle East is a different form of disaster. It is a failure of political will to provide food. There is starvation in Gaza today because the Netanyahu government, which controls the amount of food flowing in, has chosen to use access to food as a weapon of war. I've come to the floor tonight to say that this is immoral, that this use of food as a weapon of war is wrong under any structure of religion or moral code. I've come to the floor to say it violates human rights and to say that it violates international law, and that all of us should join together and call for our government, the U.S. government, to use every leverage of influence we have with our close ally, Israel, to have the Netanyahu government end this strategy. Over the last few months, public attention has turned away from the ongoing war in Gaza because there's so much else going on here in the United States and so much else going on around the world. Our newspapers and news feeds are full of stories about the Trump administration, about new tariffs, new executive orders, new events across the country, and also, quite frankly, about heartbreaking events of anti-Semitic violence against our American Jewish community. Before I turn to deliberate further on the horrific use of food as a weapon of war, I want to really note the importance of never allowing criticism of the practices of another government, or certainly criticism of the government of Israel, the Netanyahu government, to blur into discrimination or persecution of anyone based on their faith identity. I abhor discrimination, abhor persecution. I abhor anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitic acts, including assault and harassment and vandalism, have increased dramatically here in the United States. Across the country in 2024 and on into 2025, the highest level recorded since the Anti-Defamation League started tracking the data in 1979. On the first night of Passover, an arsonist set fire to the Pennsylvania governor's mansion, while the governor, Josh Shapiro, and his family were asleep inside. Sarah Milgram and Yaron Lischensky, who met working at the Israeli embassy, were murdered here in Washington, D.C., outside the Jewish Museum. And 12 people marching in support of the release of the hostages being held in Gaza were attacked and injured in Boulder, Colorado, just a week ago Sunday. I condemn these acts of anti-Semitism and violence. We must root out prejudice and discrimination. We must root it out of our hearts. We must root it out of the public acts. We must stand in arm with our Jewish community members whenever they are threatened. With that emphasis, let me be clear. As we stand arm in arm with our fellow Jewish citizens who are threatened by assault and harassment and vandalism and discrimination, we should also be standing arm in arm together against the use of the denial of food as a weapon of war, including by the Netanyahu government using that strategy in Gaza. We need an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, and I hope and pray every day that we will have such a ceasefire, and that with that ceasefire will come the swift and safe return of all the remaining hostages. We also need an immediate massive influx of humanitarian aid, including water and medicine and certainly food. But under the relevant rules of international humanitarian law, the provision of food can never be tied to some other act like a ceasefire. Like every nation has the responsibility in conflict to make sure they are not denying food in kind of a mass punishment of the other side. And therefore, food should not be contingent upon the ceasefire. It needs to be provided under moral code, under religious code, under humanitarian law, under international law. Ceasefire or no ceasefire. I've spoken previously about my concerns for the indiscriminate bombing that has killed tens of thousands of innocent Palestinian civilians in Gaza, including women and children and the elderly. Those individuals are victims as well of Netanyahu's government use of food as a weapon of war. I oppose and condemn this strategy, and I oppose and condemn the failure of the United States to use our resources and our influence to strive in every way possible to persuade the Netanyahu government to abandon the strategy of starvation. Following the horrific attacks of October 7, 2023, Israel had every right to go after Hamas. But how you do so does matter. And starving the civilian population of Gaza is morally reprehensible. Yet that is the strategy the Netanyahu government has employed, with only a periodic exemption since the start of the war. 2 days after the October 7, 2023 attack by Hamas, then Israeli Defense Minister Gallant laid out this strategy saying, and I quote, "I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed." From the start of the war through the first 15 months until the ceasefire of January 2025, the United Nations and international humanitarian organizations have warned of the growing crisis over food in Gaza. Before the war began, an average of 500 trucks entered Gaza each day to provide the basic food needed to feed 2.1 million people. That food was supplemented by food that people in Gaza were growing. When Senator Van Hollen and I visited Rafah Gate crossing in January of 2024, an average of only 150 trucks per day were getting into Gaza to provide medicine, equipment, and food. While we were at that gate, a doctor came out. He had just left through the Rafah Gate crossing after treating patients for about, I believe he told me, 3 weeks at the European hospital. And this was so essentially 3 months into the Gaza war, he said, "We are already seeing major changes in patients' ability to recover because," he said, "they're not getting enough nutrition. If you don't have enough food, your body doesn't have the energy to recover from a wound." This was just months into that war. For the following year, the number of trucks entering Gaza fell even lower, to an average of 100 trucks a day. Just a fraction of the amount of food needed to provide civilians with sufficient nutrition. And the ability to grow food in Gaza essentially evaporated under the bombardment and conditions of war. Then there was a moment of hope that this atrocity was ending. The discussion of a possibility of a lengthy ceasefire. But even as those discussions progressed, the information was flowing about already the devastating effects of malnutrition. Netanyahu's government strategy of food deprivation had inflicted massive malnutrition and health problems on the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. Malnutrition is devastating on the body. Malnutrition prevents the body from recovering from bombing-induced injuries. Malnutrition increases the risk of miscarriage. Malnutrition prevents mothers from being able to breastfeed their babies because their milk dries up. Malnutrition creates the possibility that babies will die because mothers who do not have breast milk may not be able to get clean water or formula, both being necessary for a baby to survive. Adults, as well as babies and children, suffer from the collateral effects of bodies weakened from malnutrition. And for those who do survive, the long-term health injuries are vast. Children who endure long-term hunger and malnutrition will have lifelong health damage, including stunted growth and impaired cognitive development. But then we had that break. Finally, after 15 months, January 2025, the parties agreed to a ceasefire, including the return of 33 hostages and a surge in humanitarian aid, including food. And during that ceasefire, 600 trucks a day on average entered Gaza with food and supplies. And this delivery showed that it's entirely possible to efficiently get trucks into Gaza. When Senator Van Hollen and I were at Rafah Gate in January, previous year, 2024, we witnessed miles-long backup of trucks parked along the road to Rafah Gate. And we kept hearing from the Israeli government, we just can't process these trucks and get them into Gaza. And they blamed the international organizations for the challenge. But it's clear, once Netanyahu government made a decision to get trucks in, they could get them in. We saw it during the ceasefire. We know it was possible all along. We know it was an issue of political decision-making to keep those trucks out, to inflict this hunger, to inflict this starvation on the population of Palestinians. But that food that came in, those 600 trucks, for that limited time period of 58 days, wasn't sufficient to make up for the malnutrition of the previous 15 months. It didn't erase the ravages that had been inflicted on the population. It certainly meant that enough food was getting in for kind of a daily consumption at that point, but it certainly wasn't long enough and didn't reverse the impacts of those first 15 months. And then the interlude ended. On March 2nd, the ceasefire ended. And the Netanyahu government resumed using food as the weapon of war, blockading all humanitarian aid, including food and water and medicine, from reaching civilians in Gaza. The Netanyahu government's claims that not enough aid was delivered was that enough aid was delivered during the ceasefire to compensate for the blockade to come simply was false. Repeated public reports from the United Nations, from credible news sources, from international humanitarian aid organizations, all raised the alarm month after month that widespread hunger, malnutrition, and starvation have been growing as aid supplies ran out. One way to determine if there's a shortage is to look at food prices. When there's no shortage in food, prices are stable. There's a tool that governments use and non-governmental organizations use called the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System. Fancy word for a tool to evaluate prices and how they reflect shortages. And that tool provides reports from that, and it reported that a 55-pound sack of flour, which sold for $17 in Gaza in February 2025, in May 2025, after the blockade was reimposed, sold for $520. Not $17, but $520. Here at home in the United States, restaurant all-purpose flour can be found on the internet for $18.69, a 50-pound sack, with free home delivery. In other words, the shortage of food resulted in flour being about 27 times more expensive than it had been previously in Gaza a few months before, and about 27 times more expensive than what a pound of flour costs here in the United States of America. Those staggering prices tell you several things. First, that the humanitarian feeding operations after the blockade was reimposed were absolutely unable to meet the need for food. People who have their food needs met don't pay that type of price, $520 for a sack of flour. Second, it means that food was a luxury that only the affluent in Gaza could afford, the few who had the ability to get funds from outside of Gaza. And finally, that folks who did not have that money weren't going to be able to buy flour to cook anything. Then on March 25th, just 3 weeks into the blockade, the World Food Program reported that due to the Netanyahu government's blockade, all 25 of their bakeries had run out of flour and fuel. So realize, March 2nd, the reimposition of the blockade, and within a couple weeks, by March 25th, the bakeries under the World Food Program had run out of flour and fuel. According to the New York Times, those bakeries had produced, and I quote, enough bread to supply about 70% of Gaza's population. But those bakeries were shut down weeks after the blockade reimposed. The IPC also reports that Gaza's 177 hot meal kitchens, run by various aid organizations, exhausted their supplies at the beginning of April, 1 month into reimposition of the blockade. One of these aid organizations was World Central Kitchen. World Central Kitchen is known around the world for stepping into situations and helping out where there are disasters. Humanitarian disasters of all kinds, and in this case, the disaster of the restriction of food by the Netanyahu government. World Central Kitchen's emergency meal services provide an estimated 400 to 500,000 meals per day. But on May 7, World Central Kitchen announced, quote, after serving more than 130 million total meals and 26 million loaves of bread over the past 18 months, World Central Kitchen no longer has the supplies to cook meals or bake bread in Gaza. So within weeks of the blockade being reestablished, the markets were empty, the bakeries were shut down, and the hot meal kitchens were closed. And the effect on the people in Gaza, the Palestinians of Gaza, the 2.1 million Palestinians living there, devastating. Palestinian civilians had been suffering from malnutrition from early on, as the doctor told me 3 months after the war had begun. And it just got worse and worse over time with the deprivation of food. UNICEF reports that the number of children suffering from acute malnutrition increased 80% just from February of this year to March of this year. 80% increase. That's because the children have no food. Parents have watched helplessly as they see clothes that once fit their toddlers hang off their brittle bodies. Their kids' bony rib cages and shockingly thin limbs. Increased malnutrition means it's even harder to recover from bombing-induced injuries, higher risk of miscarriages, higher risk of mothers not being able to breastfeed their babies. It means babies are weaker. It means adults are weaker. Children are weaker. Often it is not malnutrition, that is starvation, that kills someone. It is the weakened body dying from other diseases. And as noted before, the impacts on the development of the brain and the development of the body for the children can last a lifetime. World Health Organization Representative Rick Peppercorn warned that, quote, without enough nutritious food and clean water and access to health care, an entire generation will be permanently affected. And I might add, the effects are not just those of malnutrition, but also the trauma of being under constant bombardment over the course of this war, often without a home, often without electricity, often without clean water, often without access to medicine, often watching your family members die. So these children, at a minimum, we should make sure they have food. At a minimum, at a very minimum. We probably can't reverse many of the traumatic effects that will affect their lives, just like we know trauma affects those who go to war. Well, these are children and civilians living through the effects of war. The World Health Organization reports, as of May 13th, that almost 6 children had starved to death in Gaza. And if dozens of children have died from starvation, how many thousands of children more are on the verge of devastating level of malnutrition and potential death from starvation? The headlines tell the escalating and devastating story to the world. On March 2nd, the day the blockade began, the Washington Post headline read, Israel halts all aid to Gaza as ceasefire falters. On April 1st, 1 month into the blockade, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation said, fear of famine looms after all Gaza bakeries run out of flour amid month-long Israeli blockade. May 4th, 2 months into the blockade, NBC News, starvation looms as Israel's total blockade on Gaza enters its 3rd month. You start seeing the word starvation appear in story after story, headline after headline. If you or I could travel to Gaza right now, we would be absolutely shocked to see the bodies of the adults and the bodies of the children. But we can't travel there because it's closed to all of us. But reports from credible news organizations have been alerting us to this horrific disaster coming from using food as a weapon. Starvation looms as the blockade enters its third month. In mid-May, the New York Times had a headline, "In private, some Israeli officers admit that Gaza is on the brink of starvation." So we have heard time and again from the Netanyahu government, don't believe international organizations, even though they are experts. Don't believe because we are telling you there's no problem. But even the Israelis are telling the world there is a problem, that Gaza is on the brink of starvation. And then on May 16th, President Trump, our president, acknowledges starvation in Gaza as Israel airstrikes kill more than 100. The president says the U.S. will take care of the situation of Gaza on the final day of Gulf tour in Abu Dhabi. Why don't we join together, Democrats and Republicans, support President Trump in having the U.S. take care of the situation, address the starvation in Gaza. That is the moral thing to do. That is the right thing to do under any religious code. We have this incredibly close relationship with the Israeli government. We are the primary source of economic support. We have close technological support. We have a close security relationship. We share intelligence. We have many connections between members of our government and our military and our intelligence community and theirs. Why not support President Trump in using these connections to end the starvation in Gaza? You know, starvation happens many places in the world where we don't have a close relationship with the government, and it may seem very distant. But here, we are complicit because we are so closely tied and so supportive of the Israeli government. So we have a special responsibility to address this and use every leverage at our power to end it. Facing week after week of these horrifying headlines, world leaders pressed Prime Minister Netanyahu to end this strategy and implement a new plan. Only after it was reported Israel's closest friends, meaning U.S. leaders, warned the Israeli government that it would lose international support because allies could not handle pictures of mass starvation, did Prime Minister Netanyahu consider changing course. On May 19th, so now we're talking just about 3 weeks ago, after more than 11 weeks of an all-out blockade, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that, and he used the word minimal, a minimal amount of food would be allowed into Gaza. But that plan is hardly satisfactory. The new U.S. and Israeli-backed organization, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, has taken over aid distribution, working in partnership with the Israeli military and private U.S. security contractors. They're distributing aid from just 4 sites, 1 in central Gaza, near the Netzarim corridor, 3 in southern Gaza in the Rafah area. Civilians have to get one of those 4 sites to obtain a box of food. Now, if you visited Israel, you know that Gaza is about 40 miles long from north to south. It's a thin wafer along the Mediterranean coast. How do 4 sites, with 3 of them at the very southern end of that 40 miles, possibly get food to 2.1 million people? I mean, it needed hundreds of kitchens before to get food distributed throughout the country. So what you have is a formula that says millions of people are going to descend on these 4 sites to acquire a box of food. The logistics of that are impossible, and they're meant to be impossible. It's deliberately designed not to work because there's no way that 4 sites can handle handing out food to 2.1 million people. So it's produced chaotic scenes with desperate crowds of men, women, and children rushing toward boxes of aid to try to get one of those boxes, and then warning shots being fired. And not just warning shots, shots that killed Palestinians. Warning shots don't kill people. On Sunday, June 1st, ABC News reported that 31 people were killed and 200 injured when the Israeli troops opened fire. On Tuesday, June 3rd, the BBC reported 27 civilians were killed by military gunfire for, quote, deviating from the designated access routes while desperately trying to collect food. On Wednesday, June 4th, less than a week ago, the BBC called Gaza worse than hell on earth as the Israeli military closed its aid distribution sites for the day, warning that roads leading to the sites are combat zones. How do 2.1 million people get to the aid sites if the roads leading to the sites are combat zones? And if each time the food distributions are opened, people end up dying because they're shot. On Sunday, June 8th, the New York Times reports that about a half mile from a distribution site, shots were fired and 5 people were killed and 123 were wounded. Yesterday, here we are on Tuesday. Monday, yesterday, June 9th, the Associated Press reports 14 people were killed on their way to a food distribution center. This is not a plan designed to address the hunger, to end the malnutrition, to end the starvation. This is a plan to make it virtually impossible for the Palestinians to get food while telling the world, don't worry, we have a distribution plan. Everyone understands this is not a plan designed to provide food. It's a plan designed to make sure that very little food gets just to a small number of people so that the starvation continues and gets worse. The malnutrition continues and gets worse. The impact on the ravished bodies of children and babies and women and seniors and all kinds of folks who had nothing ever to do with Hamas continue to decline. The New York Times interviewed many Gazans who said they go to the distribution sites when they are closed, despite the warnings of the Israeli military, because they, quote, are desperate for food and seeking to get ahead of the large crowd. If there's only a few boxes and the site's only open for a few minutes, you're willing to wait all night because your family is starving. You want your kids to survive. You want your spouse to survive. You want to survive yourself. Of course you're going to try to beat the crowd there when you know it's impossible that the food will be sufficient for everyone to walk away with a box of food. Yesterday, June 9th, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation announced the opening of an aid distribution center in a post on its Facebook page, only to post again the center had completed distributions less than 20 minutes later and closed. It was open for 20 minutes. Of course you're going to try to beat the crowds. It's only going to be open for a few minutes. There's only going to be a modest number of boxes, nothing that could possibly serve thousands of people, let alone hundreds of thousands, let alone 2.1 million people. Of course you're going to try to go early. And the foundation closed a second center because of the chaos of the surrounding crowd. Whenever you have starvation, you're going to have chaos around food distribution centers. You know, early in this conflict, when I went to Rafah Gate in January of 2024, the International Aid Organization said, we are pushing to make the point that if there isn't sufficient food, Eventually, the trucks carrying food will be raided because people will be desperate. That always happens when people are desperate. Not a particular condition of the situation in Gaza, but wherever people are starving, they are going to raid the trucks to get food. They won't wait for a warehouse that has very little food in it to open up in an orderly fashion because there isn't enough food for everyone. So they're going to make an effort to get that food for their families. So this chaos, this was understood that this would be this way. It's not something that is, if you will, incidental to the plan. It is the plan. Not enough food, not enough distribution centers, not open long enough, deliberate effort to make hundreds of thousands of people compete with each other for a few boxes. That's chaos. Aid groups say the Netanyahu government system will be ineffective in reversing the widespread hunger because not nearly enough food is being allowed in. The United Nations has called the food that's being let in a drop in the ocean. Food is being distributed far from where it's needed most, especially for the elderly and people with disabilities. How are they going to travel? It's a 40-mile-long strip of land. How are they going to travel if you're disabled, if you're elderly, to compete with hundreds of thousands of people trying to get to just 4 distribution sites? It's impossible. Dangerous and deadly chaos at food distribution sites is being fueled not through some clever plan by Hamas, but by the deprivation of starving civilians who hope to keep their families and their children alive. And that desperation is the direct and inevitable result of Netanyahu government's strategy of deliberately imposed starvation. Even if civilians could make that dangerous journey safely, the amount of aid in this new system is wholly insufficient. During the ceasefire over the winter, 600 trucks a day entered Gaza. Only a few hundred trucks have been allowed into Gaza over the last week. And the World Food Program reports that only 1/3 of their trucks reach their destination. A handful of World Food Program bakeries actually did resume bread production on May 22nd, but the supplies were so limited that World Food Program County Director Antoine Renard warned, and I quote, "This is just a drop in the bucket of what is needed to reverse the catastrophic levels of hunger. We are a race against time to prevent widespread starvation." The World Food Program reports that, quote, "Over 140,000 metric tons of food, enough to feed the entire population for 2 months, is pre-positioned at the aid corridors and ready to be brought into Gaza at scale. Just as I saw in January 2024, trucks piled up for miles waiting to try to get in. Here we have the World Food Program reporting that now, again, food ready to move in. But the Netanyahu government is blocking it." On June 8th, 2 days ago, Yanti Suripto, the CEO of Save the Children, told Face the Nation, quote, "When we had the pause in fighting from January till March, as you will recall, we got trucks and trucks of supplies in at scale. We were able to deliver, and we treated children with malnutrition, and we did vaccinations, and we did medical care, and hospitals were operating. So this current new mechanism doesn't seem to work. The failings seem to play out exactly the way that we warned against. It is also the militarization of aid," and I'm continuing this long quote. "It's the militarization of aid. If you put men with guns near a distribution point and you ask a desperate, starving population to come and walk for miles to get boxes of food, you're going to create crowd control issues and increased risk of harm to an already incredibly desperate population. That's the end of the quote. And that is exactly what we're seeing happen. As CNN reported yesterday, June 9th, aid to Gaza hangs by a thread amid looting and starvation. Let's be clear, that trickle of aid is not about Prime Minister Netanyahu ending food deprivation as a weapon of war. It's about continuing food deprivation as a weapon of war, while deflecting just enough international pressure to keep himself in power. Jonathan Whittle, lead of the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in the Palestinian Territories, said on May 28th, "The newly developed distribution scheme is more than just the control of aid. It is engineered scarcity. The new distribution model cannot possibly meet Gaza's need." The same day, Riyad Mansour, the Palestinian Authority's representative to the United Nations, told the Security Council, quote, "Children are dying of starvation. The images of mothers embracing their motionless bodies, caressing their hair, talking to them, apologizing to them, is unbearable." And on May 30th, the New York Times reporting led with the headline, "In emaciated children, Gaza's hunger is laid bare." Every moral and religious code says this is wrong. Wrong to withhold food. Wrong to induce starvation. And under international law, it's a crime. Rule 53 of customary humanitarian law states, "The use of starvation of the civilian population as a method of warfare is prohibited." It isn't prohibited because it was some bureaucratic decision. It's prohibited because it's completely wrong under every religious and moral code. People who had no role, being punished collectively, being punished in a way that kills children, kills babies, kills adults. Other countries are speaking out in opposition to Netanyahu's government's use of food as a weapon. On May 19th, the governments of United Kingdom and France and Canada issued a joint statement saying that the amount of food the Netanyahu government is allowing into Gaza is wholly inadequate. Even Israel's leaders from across the political spectrum are speaking out that this is wrong. Amit Halevi from Prime Minister Netanyahu's Likud party said, "This war is a deception. It is not succeeding in destroying Hamas." Yair Golan, the leader of Israel's Democrats party, said in a radio interview, quote, "Israel is on the way to becoming a pariah state like South Africa was if we don't return to acting like a sane country that does not fight against civilians." Even former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert wrote in the newspaper Haaretz on May 27th, quote, "What we are doing in Gaza now is indiscriminate, limitless, cruel, and criminal killing of civilians." He continued, "Yes, Israel is committing war crimes." Mr. President and colleagues, this use of food as a weapon of war should never have happened, and it has to end. We know that the United States has such a close relationship with Israel that we can apply multiple levers to push the Netanyahu government to end it. We have a moral responsibility that's heightened by our close relationship between our two nations. We should have acted long ago to end this strategy of malnutrition and starvation. But that provides no excuse for not acting now. I pressed the Biden administration to act, and I will press the Trump administration to act. There was that moment of hope in December when Trump said, "We will address this situation." Colleagues, I have witnessed the horror of starvation in multiple countries around the world. And I believe that if the Netanyahu government would let us, as senators, go and witness firsthand a bipartisan delegation going to Gaza, we would come back and speak from the depths of our hearts, the ferocity of our understanding of right and wrong, that we have to press for this strategy of starvation to end. But we're not allowed in. So we have to depend on the press reports that have come from international organizations who have people on the ground in Gaza, from news reporting from competent international sources. We have a profound responsibility to pressure the Netanyahu government to end its strategy of starvation through food deprivation and deliver a massive influx of aid immediately. It is tempting to look away. There's a lot more going on in the world, but it is wrong to look away. We must carry that responsibility on our consciousness. We must speak and act forcefully to end Netanyahu government strategy of deliberately starving 2 million men, women, and children in Gaza. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate resume legislative session, being a period